for participants. Okay, great. So thank you everyone for joining us. We're just going to wait for like a minute or so as everyone kind of joins and comes in. So make yourselves comfortable, make yourselves warm if you've got a cup of tea or a snack or something else. We're just going to get started in a couple of minutes, just as soon as everyone's come on. So thank you so much to everyone who's joining us. We're really excited about this event tonight. Oh, I can see the numbers go up and up and up, which is very exciting. So I'm just going to give it like 30 more seconds and then we're going to start this fantastic event. So thanks very much, everyone. Okay, I'm going to give it just about another 30 seconds, maybe less. And then we will get going properly. Okay, fabulous. So hello and welcome everyone who's joined us. Welcome to the first event in the Reading Agency's Winter Webinar Series. I'm Annie Robinson and this event is all about the boy between a mother and son's journey from a world gone grey. If you don't know us, the Reading Agency is a national charity working to tackle the UK's literacy and mental health crisis through the proven power of reading. So last year we reached 1.8 million people nationwide. Our work's powered by a core partnership with public libraries, as well as partner organisations like publishers, schools, hospitals, prisons, care homes, community centres and volunteers. Tonight's event is especially poignant as November is Men's Mental Health Awareness Month. In England, there are 1 in 8 men are living with a common mental health condition. As well as this, men are actually less likely to access psychological therapies, and suicide represents the largest cause of death for men under 50. In the UK, about 75% of suicides are of men. So with these really worrying trends and at this kind of pivotal time in November, we're really keen to have this event to raise awareness and understanding about mental health. And so we're really, really grateful to be joined today by Josh and Amanda. I'm especially excited about tonight's webinar. I manage our Reading Well program at the Reading Agency, which supports people to manage and understand their health and well-being using helpful reading and bibliotherapy. So Reading Well books, our collections are recommended by health experts and people living with different conditions. And you can access these free in your public library anytime you like. So go to reading-well.org.uk for more info about that. But to introduce our incredible guests, so tonight we're joined by best-selling novelist Amanda Prowse and her son Josh. Amanda and Josh will be reading from their book that was published this month by Little A Publishers. And later we'll be joined by writer, presenter and activist Natasha Devon MBE, who's a trustee of Student Minds, a patron of No Panic, and does a huge amount of work in the mental health space to discuss this deeply personal book, which is the first book to really explore depression from the perspective of a mother and a son. And we're also going to be talking about the mental health crisis affecting young people today. Natasha's also going to be asking some questions that have been sent in to us in advance from many of you, I'm sure. So thank you for joining us, and thank you to Amanda and Josh. So I'm just going to hand over to you for you to tell us a little bit about yourselves and about your amazing book.
Thank you, Annie. So I'm Amanda Prowse, and I am a UK-based fiction writer, much more used to creating books with a pleasing, happy ending than having to write my own story of myself and my son. The book came about almost by accident. I've said it's the book I wish I didn't have to write. I'd rather my son didn't have a mental illness, and I'd rather Josh hadn't slid into such a deep depression that he planned to take his own life. Even saying that feels most monstrous to me, even after all this time. So yeah, our first non-fiction book is The Boy Between, which I've co-written with Josh. We've written a chapter each, and thank you so much for having us, and thank you to the Reading Agency.
Hi, I'm Josiah Hartley, and this is my first ever book, and I am The Boy Between.
Okay, thank you so much. It would be really great now to just hear a brief reading from you guys that you prepared for from the book, and then we'll go into our question and answer.
The decision to end my life was one that came easily. There was not, as you might imagine, some great wrangling with the consequences of something so final. None at all. By the time I came to the conclusion that to slip away from this existence was probably the best thing for me, I had lost the ability to think deeply about anything or anyone. I was beyond reason, with my reality skewed. I wasn't sad, I was numb. This state felt interminable. I was exhausted, and the thought of having to spend the rest of my days in this endless, blank circle of desperation was one I was not prepared to contemplate. What was the point? I woke that day in the mental fog I had grown accustomed to. All thoughts were slow and slurred, making rational thinking improbable. It must have been daytime, as the sun rather unsuccessfully shone through my perpetually drawn blinds. A few weeks prior, looking out at the blue sky was almost a treat, something to break up the monotony of the day. But I was past that now. Time had lost all meaning. I could have been in that room anywhere between 5 days to 3 weeks, sleeping up to 18 hours a day, and spending the other 6 in a trance-like haze, staring up at the ceiling. My bed was an island. It happened to be in a medium-sized UK city, but in terms of loneliness and isolation, it might as well have been in the South Pacific. I occasionally left my island to get water, food, or use the loo, but recently, even thirst had failed me. The pull of that bed was like trying to escape a black hole. I felt beyond the event horizon, and even the greatest invitation of all time would not have tempted me away from that 6 foot by 4 foot space that was my world. I often think about that boy sitting on the end of the bed, with the tablets in his palm. A boy living in the space between darkness and light. I think of how his story nearly ended on that day. I think about his family telling tales of a life that became overwhelming, and was now no more than a footnote in their history. I was that boy, and it was not my last day, but I came close.
Wish I'd gone first now. This is from our introduction. It's hard to write with honesty about depression, suicide, and all the unpalatable truths that come with both. Hard to find the positives and the hope, because it's a dark topic and one that we would rather not talk about. But here we are going to try. Josh and I would like to tell the story of what happened when mental illness came to live in our ordinary house with us, an ordinary family. I thought mental illness, frightening, hard to fathom, and even harder to accept, was something that happened to other people. Turns out we are other people, and here we are. The Boy Between is the account of Josh's depression to the point where he not only considered, but also planned when and how he would end his life. And he very nearly succeeded. This is the first time either Josh or I have spoken publicly about the demon that he carries on his back. It's been the hardest thing that we as a family have ever been through. Mainly because as parents, Simeon and I felt woefully ignorant of how to deal with the situation. And partly because mental illness does not always have the neat, predictable, hopeful conclusion that we humans take such comfort from. It's almost as if we can cope with something because we know that the situation won't be forever. But what if it is? Words of solace are often wrapped in this theme. Time is a great healer, and time heals all wounds, and even this too shall pass. But with our son's depression, there came a moment when we had to accept that maybe none of the above applied. This thought is a devastating one for us and for our son, that he may always be vulnerable, and the okayish days of just about coping might actually be as good as it gets. The idea of that does not get any easier.
Thank you both. That's really, really powerful to hear from the book. So I'm now going to introduce Natasha Devon MBE, writer, presenter, activist who tours schools and colleges through the UK and beyond, talking, delivering talks, as well as conducting her own research on mental health, body image, gender inequality. She also presents on LBC every Saturday evening. So Natasha, as well as this, is a member of the Men and Boys Coalition, specifically advising on reducing male suicide rates, and is a certified instructor for Mental Health First Aid England and with the eating disorder charity Beat. So thank you so much for joining us, Natasha, and for leading the next part of tonight's event, which will be sharing questions that came in from the audience via email. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Annie. Thank you, Josh and Mandy. That was incredibly powerful. And without wishing to sound unduly boastful, I get asked to do a lot of these, and I rarely say yes. But your book really, really did something to me. It captured me because I just thought it was such a clever idea to have the same events documented from two different perspectives. And such a needed idea as well, because as you know, my work takes me into schools, colleges, events all over the world. And very often I'm talking to teenagers during the day, and then in the evening, I'll speak to their parents. And I'll notice that there's just this slight difference in perspective, and they're not a million miles away from each other, and yet they're speaking at complete cross purposes, and there's all these assumptions about what the other person is thinking and misunderstandings. And it's such a shame because they're both on the same page. You know, they both want the person who is suffering to get better. And I very often see my own job as being a bridge between those two perspectives. So to have a non-fiction novel like yours, which does that, I think is just going to help so many people. And another reason why I loved it is because, as we know, for mental illness to manifest, there really needs to be at least one of three things. You need the genetic or the kind of nature elements, the hereditary elements. You need trauma or an adverse child experience, or some kind of environmental aspect, so something like poverty or extreme prolonged stress. And having been a mental health campaigner now for more than a decade, I've noticed that there's this tendency to really focus on the trauma bit and something happened to me when I was a child bit. And we forget those other two aspects, which are just as important in terms of the conversation. And you know, your book, you go right back into Josh's really early childhood, and you say, Josh, that you were looking at other children in the playground at infant school and thinking, I don't understand why they're so happy, when I think you say life is such a serious business, you know, from such a young age. So my question to you, and I have questions from the audience, but the thing I wanted to ask you was, if there are parents who have tuned in this evening and they've come to this webinar because they're thinking, what did I do? And they're blaming themselves and beating themselves up, what would your message be to them?
Very probably didn't do anything wrong. There's so many factors cause depression. That's part of the horrible nature of the disease. If it was one thing, we could just fix that one thing. I spoke to a psychiatrist and several GPs, and they all said, was there one thing that happened to you? Was there any single event that happened to you? X, Y, and Z, which I won't list. And no, the answer was none to all of them. And that made it, in a way, harder, I think, because if there was, you can at least try and deal with that trauma. But there wasn't this sort of speed bump that I had to get over. It was just so many factors more, you know, environmental stress, as you said earlier, that rather than a single event of trauma. And also I said I always felt quite different from other people, even from a very young age. Even when we had a 2-hour break on one of the lunch breaks, and most of the kids were happy to kick a ball for a solid 2 hours, and that was fine for 10 minutes, but I sort of got very bored quickly. I sort of, I don't know, thought about things a bit more, I suppose.
Yeah, there is a point in the book, isn't there, where you talk about you're wrestling with these really big existential questions, even as a young child, like what's the meaning of life? Why are we here? And actually there is a theory that depression is kind of tied up with that kind of intelligence, that sort of big global thinking, that actually it's just the weight of being human that it is. I'm not saying that it causes depression, but it's certainly an element of it. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think sort of the big questions are questions that I used to think about a lot more, but they're unanswerable. Otherwise we'd have an answer by now. And I think it's easy to get weighed down and spend quite a large portion of your day thinking about hypothetical situations and the greater questions, when it doesn't help you have a clean room and brush your teeth twice a day. And it's the sort of got to dial things back and keep your thinking relevant to your daily life, because it's not helpful to think about why we're here, if there are aliens, all that sort of great stuff, every second of every day, because the small things just slip by, and then before you know it, you're living in it, your life is just a complete mess.
That's good advice. Keep your thinking relevant to your daily life. And Mandy, you know, you're obviously a incredibly loving and competent parent, but I love the fact that you've written without judgment as well. You've said there are things I would have done differently if I'd known then what I know now. But what would your message be for any parents that are watching this evening?
I suppose the important message is that most children do not have mental health crisis. Most children do not end up severely depressed, and so don't overly or unduly worry. You know, that's a nice thing to be reassured by. But also, I think it's about letting your child be and not going straight into solution mode at any small thing or any big thing, because I know that was certainly my tendency. You know, I want to be one of those mums like a sweeper in curling who goes ahead removing every lump from the path so that my son's glide path is the best it can be. And I would say probably don't do that so much. I think maybe just let them be, and if they don't have the same idea or life plan as you that you have in your head for them, that's okay. I feel that maybe I think it's interesting to hear what you say about the big picture thinking. I don't know if Josh remembers, but when he was 3, I put him to bed one night and I said, he's always asking me so many questions I didn't have the answers for. I said I had to limit him to 5 whys, because after 5 I was out. This is kind of pre-Google, so I was in big trouble. And he said, I've got one more question. I said, what's that, darling? He said, how do we know we're not in a computer game and that someone is controlling us? And I said, Josh, I don't know. I really don't know. And I kind of think I wish I'd maybe investigated his thoughts and ideas a bit more and maybe given him some better answers that would stop his cogs turning. You know, if I'd been smarter in the answers I'd given him and maybe tried a bit harder to find the answers, maybe I could have calmed his thoughts slightly. And I think not go into panic mode, which I think I have a tendency to do, very emotional response to a very cerebral problem. It didn't really help, but that is my default, to feel very emotional and to want to build him a nest and feed him and make it better. And I think that's not always the best thing to do.
So Josh, you were basically a doctorate level philosopher at the age of 3. This is what we've learned. I like what you said, Mandy, about not always trying to provide solutions, because there's actually some neuroscientific evidence around this, that when we're having these emotional heart-to-hearts, what we're looking for is connection. So often the worst thing that you can do is say, oh, you should do this. It's better to say, oh, I can't imagine what that must be like for you, but thanks for telling me, and just be with someone. And that actually optimizes the amount of dopamine in your brain, so it does something physical to the person. So I like the idea that as a parent you get used to this dynamic of my child has a problem and I fix it, and yet there are certain kind of scenarios where that's not the appropriate course of action.
Yeah, massively. And I think actually I've only learnt that recently, you know, and I'm in my 50s. It's taken me until now to understand that actually I don't need to make everything okay. Sometimes Josh wants to just tell me how he's feeling, and that's enough.
So I have some questions here from the audience here tonight, and I've put them in an order that I think makes sense, so that it's not necessarily in the order that they were sent. But our first question is, and this is to both of you, over the years, what have you found has helped you cope and get through your most difficult days?
I think unfortunately there's not a single thing. I wish there was. But I think I know personally for me, I'm not afraid to take a mental health day anymore, which I never would have done a few years ago. But for today, for example, I went to sleep at 12 midday, slept for about 5 hours, which just because I was feeling properly rubbish today for no reason whatsoever. So I just take time to yourself. And from the outside looking in, it can appear selfish, but if that's the difference between you having a truly horrible existence for a day and something that's bearable, you just have to do it. I think it's a bit of a cliche, but spend as much time outdoors as you can sometimes. I personally know I've never felt worse after a long walk in nature. I've never made me feel worse. You just got to take things day by day. You can't look too far ahead. I know the better I'm feeling mentally, the further I allow myself to look into the future. But on a really rubbish day, I literally take things hour by hour, minute by minute if I have to. And I just really think about what's best for me right now.
What about you, Mandy? What kind of techniques have you learned?
I've learned that it's okay to say I'm not coping very well and I haven't got the answers and I don't know what to do. And I tend to go to my mum and dad's, you know, and just hide, get in the bath, cry, all that sort of stuff. But I think that's okay. I used to think I had to beam. It's all going to be okay. It's all going to be fine. Like some super magic Mary Poppins who had all the answers in her big bag. But of course, I'm not that person. I'm just a human. I'm just a mum who's really figuring it out as I go along. And I stumble very often and I don't always know what to do for the best. And I think I always felt if I gave into that and said that out loud, it would make Josh panic because I needed to be flying the plane. You know, if I'm in crisis and I fall apart, what's Josh doing in the back there? It's scary. But actually now I do. I said, you know what, today I'm really not coping. I talk to my mum and dad most days. I think, you know, I'm lucky I've got parents, but if you have anyone who can be your listening support, and that could be an online forum, a charity, a friend, a neighbour, wherever that comes from, I think it's really important to know that your journey with someone in your home with a mental illness is tough for you too. And so it's okay to let yourself give into that and have a low day if you want. It doesn't mean you're plummeting to the depths of depression, but it's okay to feel like you're struggling and sort of give into it a bit, because your mental health matters just as much as anyone else's. So I think that's the key thing, is giving into it, Natasha. And also I'm now not afraid to ask for help. I used to think I had to figure it out myself, and I was embarrassed and ashamed of what was going on in our house. So I tried not to talk about it. And when Josh first became depressed, I would say, oh, he's feeling a bit under the weather, which is incredibly, it must be hard. It must have been very hard for Josh, who felt he was really struggling, to have the person who loves him most in the world, one of them, say, oh, he's a bit under the weather. I mean, it really did him a disservice, I think. And I think I regret that massively. So I think that honesty, Josh, as well, honesty with each other. I don't want to break any confidence, but Josh has had the worst day today. And the fact, just before we came on air, I was downstairs and I was just sitting having a good old cry. And I said to my husband, Josh has had such a bad day. I feel like we've taken backward steps. And he said, no, because a year ago he wouldn't have told you. And I thought, that's a good point, isn't it, Josh? I think a year ago he would have said, yeah, I'm okay. But today he was able to tell me. And I think that's massive. I've actually taken a big positive from it. As rubbish as it is, I've taken a positive from that today.
That's a really wise thing to say. And I always explain it to people who are in the recovery process. I think often when they have a bad day, they feel that they're back to square one, and recovery is so exhausting that you almost have that thought of, I can't do it again. But every day that you are in recovery with mental illness, you are learning about your own brain and the way you communicate with others and your place in the world and the techniques that work and don't work. So I always say it's a bit like if you're knitting. If you have a bad day, you've dropped a stitch, but it doesn't mean you haven't already knit the row. You know, there's still a lot of progress there that you've made that's valuable and will help you with your journey. But I do think, you know, in a lot of media, and again, this was another brilliant thing about your book, is in a lot of media, mental health stories are presented as, here I am at my lowest ebb and now I'm better, and happy ending. And you know, you very much present depression as something that you're living with and managing, and something that is still possible to have a fulfilled life alongside, but that you have to learn to manage. And I think that's a much more responsible and realistic message, actually. I'm going to move on to the next question. This is for Mandy. What advice would you give to mothers going through a similar experience with their child?
First of all, my heart goes out to you, because I know it can feel like the loneliest road. And I think actually that's probably one of my biggest bits of advice too. You feel like you're the only one who's walking this path. I personally felt like a complete failure because I didn't know how to best help Josh, or even where to get the right level of help. I didn't know what to do, and I kept hoping it would pass, and I thought it was a phase. And then when you have tried everything and that person you love is still not responding, it can feel hopeless. But it's not hopeless, because I learned that all those little things that you do, whether it's taking them a cup of tea, turning their pillow over, taking them for a walk, cooking them a bowl of soup, whatever it is, it's like turning a tanker. And Josh says a lot of the time, the things I did didn't make a difference. But actually looking back collectively, all those little things gave him moments of relief or joy that helped on his path. So don't feel bad if all you feel you can do is small things and you go to bed feeling it's been another pointless or useless day. Don't, because keeping your child and the person you love here is the greatest achievement you can possibly have. And if you have done one good thing for them, you've done something to aid their recovery. So don't be too hard on yourself, and know that you are absolutely not alone. There are millions of us right now in families up and down the country, all over the world, especially at the moment when life is tough. So know that you're not alone. We walk a different path to those who suffer with depression, but I would argue it's often just as hard in a different way, and arguably the one with sometimes less support. So we need to support each other. And it's not about, sometimes when I meet other parents, particularly Josh's peer group, I can remember bumping into people and they'd say, oh, you know, it's wonderful, so-and-so's doing this, or they're traveling there and they're doing this. And I'd think, oh, my son hasn't stood up for 4 days, hasn't washed his hair for a month. I can't join in this conversation. And so a more honest conversation about what's going on under your roof, I think, would help everyone's barriers come down a little bit.
That's really good advice. And it's probably a good time to mention that Young Minds have a dedicated parent helpline. So if your child is under 25 years old, you can call them and get free confidential advice, because, you know, the parent journey is, as you say, equally difficult sometimes, certainly equally important, but nowhere near as recognized. The next question, I think, it's for both of you, and it's, how did you approach writing such a personal story? What was the process from idea to editing?
From the idea was, we were at a real deadlock in the house. If you had depression under your roof, it takes a tendril in every single room. You can't really escape it, I think. But I was the one suffering, but I think that's fair to say from your perspective. Definitely. But we weren't making progress, and I think I, at that stage, was aware of the effect my depression was having on my parents, and I knew I had to get better for them as well as myself. I think a lot of the time it's often easier to focus your recovery for someone else than yourself. Because if you don't care about your own life, it's hard to make it better. But if you still care about your parents' worries and life, it's easier to get better for them. And we reached a stage where the recovery wasn't improving, and Mandy sent me an email saying, what can I do to help you today? And I responded, open my window, get me a cup of tea, change my bed linen. And she replied, oh, what, like you're ill? And I replied, well, I am ill, because with mental, we often disconnect mental and physical health when we really shouldn't. And I was ill. I was acutely ill, and I replied, and Mandy replied. Before we know it, we had about 20,000 words in this email chain. Wow. And one of, without my knowledge, one of Mandy's editors came to the house just for a work discussion, and Mandy showed in the emails, and she said, "This is a book here. This could be helpful for people to read." And it sort of went from there. But it was incredibly hard to write some days. Some real unpalatable truths came out in the wash, if you like. And just recounting some of your darkest memories for strangers to read was daunting. But at the back of our minds, or certainly mine, if this can help one sufferer, it's all worth it. If this just helps one person feel a little less alone today, I had to try and get it down. And I think part of the way this disease spreads is the stigma and taboo around it. If we don't, especially young men, don't talk about the way we're feeling enough. And I know that if I didn't talk about it, I became part of the problem and not the solution.
I'm really glad you've given that answer, because Josh was asked once before, and he said the hardest part was spending 8 hours a day with my mother. So I'm actually delighted that he's come up with something that's, that's a bit less brutal, but I understand. Josh is also severely dyslexic, so that had its own set of challenges. So the actual writing process, Josh would dictate to me exactly what he was feeling, and then I would give him what I had typed, and he could then edit it at his own pace. So it was a really sort of slow, drawn out process. But Josh is right, it was it's weird. There's certain things, lots of family, I would have said before this happened to us, Natasha, I was a bit of a smug mum. You know, I eat dinner with my kids, we go on holiday with them, I know their friends, they text me when they arrive. Yeah, they're great boys. I've got their really lovely kids, and I thought, I know them back to front. You know, it must be awful to be one of those parents when that comes along and, you know, pulls the rug from under you. I never thought in a million years I was that mum and that we were that family, but we were. And I would have said we were good communicators, but we weren't. And it's only, I think, that writing the book has really, really made us talk about things that actually we probably would never have discussed. So I'm very thankful for it, particularly in the edit process that the question mentioned, because we had to really dig deep, didn't we, Josh? And yeah, I think it's, I hope that answers the question.
No, it does. And it's amazing, isn't it? The ideas that you pick up about the kinds of people or the kinds of families that suffer with mental illness. I mean, one of the things that inspired my work in schools was the fact that I was really cross when I found myself with a severe eating disorder in my mid-20s. I remember having this really irrational thought of, I can't believe this has happened to me. I got all A's in my A-levels. As though sort of that kind of academic intelligence, it kind of insulates you from emotional distress. And so I realized that at school, I was very lucky to have some mental health education, but I don't know if you relate to this, but in the 90s, all the stuff that we saw about mental health was very much, people sharing their stories of very extreme sort of addiction and eating disorders and things like that. And whilst it was interesting, I didn't relate to it. And I thought what we need to do is we need to universalize this a bit more and make people realize that it can happen to anyone. And in fact, that regardless of whether you're one of the 1 in 4 that will experience a mental health issue, 4 in 4 of us have got a head. You know, we've all got a brain, we've all got mental health, and it's actually something we all need to know about. So yeah, I loved that answer. I thought it was a great answer. The next question is for Josh. It must be tough doing lots of press and interviews, this person's written. Have you found your recovery has been made easier by talking about your experience?
Well, like everyone, I have good days and bad days, and doing the PR for this book's no different. But some days are harder than others, but some of the, I just got to know in the back of my mind that I know that I'd have liked to have watched this when I was slightly lower than I am now. And so if one person watching this, or even parent of someone who's suffering watches this and it gives them a better understanding, it's all worth it. And it's just a real, I think some of the PR we've done has felt like a real privilege and I got to chat to some amazing people that I wouldn't have had an opportunity to chat to otherwise. And just constantly learning from them and learning things about myself due to it. I'm just quite thankful for it all, to be honest.
It must be difficult though, if you're doing, 4 or 5 interviews a day and you're talking about some really dark moments in your past. Do you find that exhausting, or do you find that cathartic?
I think it depends how well I've slept, unfortunately, but overall cathartic. Okay. And it's often, if it's a radio presenter, often off air, they'll say, oh, I've completely suffered in a very similar way to you. And those dialogues often don't start until you're the first person to say, I suffer, and that's part of the problem. But it has been overall an extremely cathartic experience.
I know definitely that you speaking as candidly as you do will help a lot of men in particular, because we know that for all kinds of reasons, men are less likely to speak up if they have a mental health issue. And I always find it slightly reductive the way, you have those mental health campaigns where they're like, men talk. And I'm like, well, if they could, they would, And sometimes it takes somebody to role model that behavior for you and show you how to do it like a man, if that makes sense. Because if you're a man and the only people you ever hear talking emotionally around you are women, you're not going to think those conversations are for you. So it's an incredibly important thing that you're doing. The next question is again for Josh. The current pandemic and lockdown is causing so much isolation, anxiety and pain where so many young people are struggling. What would you say to somebody who was currently feeling as you were, and what advice would you give to them?
Well, it's incredibly tough, unfortunately. But I think to try and put a positive spin on it, if you are in a bubble of 6 at a university, don't think of it as you're cut off from everyone but those six. Just think of it as a great opportunity to make 5 really strong connections and relationships, and know that if you look out for 5 other people can look back out for you, and you can have a really strong bubble, if you like. But it is so tough. I feel really sorry for new university students.
Me too.
Yeah, I can't. Some of the halls that have rightly so gone into lockdown, it can't be easy for them, and we're just so uncertain. Will they be able to go home for Christmas? Hopefully, if they get tested and they will be negative, they should be able to. But it's just so uncertainty, and also a lot of people my age who have recently graduated, I know, are daily just struggling to find jobs in the field they've graduated in, and you know that's unfortunately probably going to be the future for these new students as well. So they've got a lot on their plate right now. There's not, I don't know, but I think, you know, in decades gone by, going to university was a sort of golden ticket to a job, which I just don't think is the case anymore. So it is really tough. But my advice to you is if you're sort of, you're depressed and you're low, but you're not in danger to yourself, I think you just got to really try and reach out, if it's your parents or your peers, because people do care. Part of depression's, like, one of its nastiest tricks, it makes you feel completely alone, and one of the only people, it makes you feel like you're the only one who suffered in this way, when it's unfortunately not the case. There's multiple people in your halls, multiple people on your street also suffering. So you've really just got to reach out. People do care and they will listen. I know that because the people there for me now were there for me then. It just didn't feel that way. But if you're in crisis, it doesn't always feel like it, but just staying on this planet is an achievement. And you've got to take things day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute. Just things can and do usually get better. So just hang on in there.
Thank you. I completely agree with what you say about feeling sorry for this year's freshers, because not only are a lot of them effectively locked in halls of residence, but they didn't get the chance to do their A-levels that they prepared for. There was this huge debacle over university entrance. They weren't sure if they were going to be able to go to their first choice of uni. And if you track their journey backwards, they were also the generation who had reformed GCSEs. So they prepared for GCSEs that they took a completely different type of exam. So it must feel to that particular year group of young people just the most momentous bad luck. But in the conversations that I've been having with people who that affects, I've said, you know, try if you can to see this as an opportunity, because learning how to deal with uncertainty, anxiety, stress is actually the most important skill that anybody can learn. And you're being given the opportunity to do it now. And it also feels a little bit like everything's on pause. And so, and I know that you talk about in the book, there's a moment where I think your stepdad says to you, you know, you don't have to carry on this course that you're on at university. So many people are on a treadmill and they're just doing what's expected of them. And then they don't reflect until much later on and think, is that really what I wanted to do? But there is this opportunity, isn't there, now in lockdown to think about what it is that actually makes us fulfilled. And, you know, I hesitate to use the word happy, but I guess content, and gives us meaning and purpose. And, you know, I'm trying to reframe it as an optimistic thing because everything's so dreadful. But in a way, it is an opportunity, isn't it?
Yeah, and we have to look at it. We have to look at it like that. It's also this race. It's especially amongst the social media age, my demographic. Everything feels like a competition. And if you're not winning, you're just falling apart. You're falling behind. And it feels like society's on pause, which is quite nice in a way, because you can take time for yourself, you know, reflect on yourself, and you're not, as you said, that treadmill of just trying to keep up with everyone else. You can just take some more time for yourself. But also, to go back to the freshers, I think they've been lied to as well, which I don't agree with. A lot of universities, it's out of their hands, but promised in-person teaching, and now obviously it's not going ahead. Everything's online, and I think rightly so, a lot of people want some of their tuition fees back, and right now it's a really tough situation where it's a blanket no from universities. So we just have to see how that pans out.
And we will come back at the end to the ongoing work that you are doing with universities. The next question is for Mandy, and this is a very different book to what you usually write. Has it made you consider doing more real life stories or writing in a different genre?
That's a great question. I'm already writing my second non-fiction book about female and being fat, which I think is really interesting. So body image and body positivity, or lack of in society. As someone who has been slim, slender, skinny, fat, obese and morbidly obese, I kind of see it from all angles. And so I think that's the story I want to get down on paper, and I'm about halfway through and I'm really enjoying it. But I have to be honest, and you and I have had a conversation about this ourselves this evening, fiction is a different ballgame altogether, and my first love will always be writing stories. So I will always write my fiction, you know, sort of family sagas, slices of life, that kind of thing, that are very often issue based. But writing non-fiction is a lot harder. They didn't tell you that. It's a lot harder. I might do maybe one or two, you know, books like that. But I think, yeah, definitely fiction will always be my first love. It's very hard work, this non-fiction thing. And doing a subject that you take on, you have to do it such justice. So the research and, you know, every single detail, every little nuance has to be absolutely right. Because if you're going to take on a subject, then you have to make it the best it possibly can be. Otherwise, you do it a disservice, and that's the opposite of what you want to achieve. So I think it's, I think I find it quite exhausting in a way that I don't when I'm writing fiction. I can just let my mind run away, whereas this takes a lot of concentration for obvious reasons. So yeah, and other genres, I don't know, possibly maybe a thriller one day, who knows, I don't know.
It's so funny that you say that, because I guess it depends on what you're used to. I find fiction way harder than non-fiction. Yeah. But then everything I'd written had been non-fiction up until recently. But it's, yeah, we were talking about this before the session began, and I was saying how the difference between writing fiction and non-fiction is like the difference between playing piano and guitar. It's all music, but it's a very different skill set. That's certainly my experience anyway. The next question is for both of you, and it's, has writing the book brought you closer together?
I think it's, you know, we've always been very close. We're very lucky for that. But I think Josh's depression was like putting up a glass wall between us, and it made communication very hard. And it made honest communication very hard. So I think that we've taken that glass wall away, and we know each other inside out, back to front. I've seen Josh at his best, and I've seen Josh at his absolute worst. And I think he would say the same for me and my husband too. Josh has seen us at our best, and he's seen us sync with him. And I think when you've been through like something like that together, it means that you go forward with a healthy respect for each other and a greater understanding of how to manage the other person maybe. And yeah, I would say we're definitely closer, but we were already really close, but I think we're communicating better, which I think is the thing. Is that fair?
Yeah, I don't think we had much of a choice for this book. The justice it deserved. I think we had to ask a lot of difficult questions about each other. So yeah, definitely closer because of it.
We decided if we were going to write it, we weren't going to sanitize our relationship. We weren't going to make it saccharine sweet. We were going to just say exactly how it is. I made a lot of mistakes, and I'm still learning. I'm still learning. And I think we agreed, didn't we, Josh? If we were going to do it, it was like rip the Band-Aid off and just do it. And that's really what we've done.
Did you have to have any difficult conversations? Because there are a couple of points in the book where Josh says, my mum was really annoying me. and me reading it, I was like, oh.
Welcome to my world, Natasha. Every day.
Yeah. Did it bring about some difficult conversations?
Yeah, and there were even some days where Mandy just couldn't stop crying. And I get it. But it's a day where you want to make progress. I think it comes across in the book. I'm more sort of scientific approach to a lot of things and slightly more blunt, and Mandy is more emotionally driven, and I think had to sort of, especially in the first couple of weeks, sort of fuse it to how we were going to work together.
It was the first time I was hearing a lot of the things that I knew had happened, but I didn't want to know the detail. I didn't want to hear it previously because I found it too hard. But with this, we had no choice. And so I would look Josh in the eye and he would tell me the detail about things. And that was really, really hard. So yes, and I'm his mum. I might be his co-author, but I'm his mum first and foremost. And yeah, there were a lot of very teary days, which I did notice slightly annoyed you.
There are some moments of really dark comedy. I mean, it could just be me because I've got quite a dark sense of humor, but there's one point where you describe asking Josh how he is. and he gives you an honest answer, and then you go, what the hell? And Josh is almost like, well, why did you ask if you didn't want to know?
Yeah, but that's exactly what used to happen. You know, I would literally I'd go in the morning and he'd have his mop of hair on the pillow hiding under a duvet, and I'd say, how are you feeling, darling? And he'd be like, fine. And then I'd go back in 20 minutes and I'd say, how are you feeling, darling? He's like, oh, do you know what? I'm absolutely great. And I'd go, really? He'd say, no, I'm exactly the same as I was 10 minutes ago. But it was like, I didn't know what else to do. You know, I didn't know what else to say to him. And yeah, I'm glad. Yeah, there's a lot of dark humor in it. And I hope actually that lightens it in a way, Natasha, because I think otherwise it could be a hard read.
This is a really interesting question for Josh. And it says, I know you've received a lot of messages from people sharing their stories of depression. Does it help you, or does it make life harder being burdened in that way? And then this person has written, I know that when I'm struggling, I can't hear about other people's struggles as it brings me down.
There has been a couple of days where I've received too many messages to reply to give everyone justice. And I still feel like I'm letting people down, because all I can do is send people a message back. There's no magic wand, unfortunately. And so you get messages from people and it's like, my son is in a very similar situation, suffering in the same way you, and I know how much that hurts. I know how tough it is. And you just want to wave that magic wand, but it doesn't exist. And I know no Instagram message, no matter how well crafted, is ever going to change that. So it is tough, but it just really highlights that we've got to do what we can to try and really fix this problem, rather than just, hide it away. But it's an extreme. It is a big burden. But I'd never want someone to not message me if they think it will help in any way, because I am happy to talk about it, and there's any advice I can give, I'm happy to try and help. But I just know that I'm never going to be able to do enough, and I'd always like to do more. But it is tough from the other end of a phone, because you just want to wave that magic wand that doesn't exist. It is really tough. But if you're listening to this, don't ever feel about putting the more burden on me. It's the least I can do.
I really relate to that. And I have that feeling often of people sharing their experiences with me and just thinking, I want to make it better for you. But it was like I was saying earlier, in just hearing what they have to say non-judgmentally and signposting to further services of support, you have actually done something. You've done something incredibly valuable, and you might have set that person on the pathway to recovery or ensured that they got better faster. So I don't think that you should ever underestimate the value of doing things. Equally, I don't feel that you should feel obliged to have to respond to everything, because your first priority should always be yourself. In an aeroplane, you always put your own mask on before assisting others. And as you get into the world of mental health campaigning, you'll find more and more of these messages coming in. And a lot of the campaigners I know have almost like a stock response that they'll send out, signposting people saying, look, I'm really sorry, I'm getting such a high volume of messages, or I'm going through a bit of a tough time myself at the moment, but here are some people that you can talk to, if that's helpful at all.
That's a good idea.
And Mandy, what was the hardest thing about switching from fiction to non-fiction? I kind of feel like you've covered this a bit, but was there anything that was particularly hard?
I suppose I would just add that, it was one thing that I couldn't, when I'm writing fiction, if I leave my characters in an unhappy or precarious place, I say, and they all went to the beach and were having a lovely day, and then I go to sleep. And then the next day I wake up and I delete that, and they're back in the terrible situation that I left them. But of course, I didn't get to do that with this, because it was Josh's story. And I found it emotionally very draining, because it was my son's truth, and it was a lot harder.
And finally, Josh, you have said that one of the things that you really want to do is to raise awareness of what universities should be doing, their kind of duty of care, I guess, to their students. And that's so topical at the moment, actually, not just because of the situation we find ourselves in 2020. There has always been this real disconnect where you're so well supported. Most young people have a structure of support around them, and then suddenly it's like, oh, you're 18, you're an adult, off you go, and all of that falls away. And it's no coincidence that so many people actually cite that move to university as the moment when they really started struggling with their mental health. You know, the average onset age for most mental illnesses is 14, but it's that kind of 18 to 21-year-old period where the symptoms generally start to really worsen. So what do you think that universities could and should be doing better?
I think it's incredibly tough, unfortunately. I went to 2 universities, one where mental health wasn't really spoken about, and it didn't seem to be a problem. But looking back, that's probably just because we didn't talk about it rather than it wasn't going on, of course. And it felt like there wasn't a lot in place. There weren't really the services there, but at the same time, students weren't taking their own lives. At a second university I attended, students taking their own life was, you know, headline grabbing and disgustingly common. I think pretty much everyone knew someone or was friends with someone else who knew it. Everyone could. We didn't have to get a lot of links till someone had taken their own life through a society or course or whatever it was. And it felt like there was quite a lot in place at the university with the problem, but still not enough. They used to have a warden system where every hall had almost a headmaster where you could speak to if you had a problem, and would, if you missed a certain amount of lectures, would bring you into his office and say, is everything going on? What's going on? Which was helpful. And that got axed the year I went into the second year. That all got axed, which I think is a real shame. There's sort of a buddy system where usually a master's or PhD student lives within the halls, and he was in the room next to me and was a really, really nice person, but I think had something like half a day of training, and it's unfair on them and unfair on the people they've got a duty of care for. That sort of, it's just not enough. That half a day isn't enough to reach out when you're looking after 30 people, or possibly more than one of them are in a crisis situation. It's just not good enough. And I don't blame him at all. I thought he was great and really doing his best, but it's the system he was part of. I think we really just need complete reform, really. We need every university to be up to the same level of care. And I don't currently know what that looks like, but I think we just need nationwide rollout of exactly the same care, same counselling sessions, whatever that might be. And I know at the second university I attended, there are counsellors and there are therapists. I'm sure they do a great job, but sometimes, well, firstly, the wait times, especially in peak periods, could be, I don't even want to put a figure on it, but it's several weeks. I'd say 6 weeks. And that's, if you're in a crisis now, that's not really good enough. And also a lot of the phone lines were only during office hours. And funnily enough, a lot of student crises don't happen 9 to 5, especially when, you know, substances and alcohol is involved, maybe for the first time possibly, away from home. And it's, when you're at school, it's quite easy to feel wanted. If you miss a single lesson, someone's on your back about it. Someone's like, where were you for this lesson? And rightly so. But you can miss months, literally months of university, and nobody notices, which, one, is hard to feel wanted. If you're there or you're not, it doesn't make a difference to anyone else. And secondly, it's that feeling away from that safety net and bubble of home, usually moving away from home for the first time. It's easy to fall through the cracks, and no one really can just check on you. And it's incredibly tough.
You're so right. I mean, as you both know, I'm a trustee for Student Minds, the student mental health charity, and they have a charter of good practice for universities because, as you say, Josh, the thing that's needed is consistency. There are some universities that are brilliant. There are some universities that do nothing at all. But also everything that you're saying about, if you miss one lesson at school, someone calls your parents. You can miss months of lectures, and not having that feeling of belonging, which is actually really crucial for mental health, is something that's reported all the students pretty much that the charity speaks to. So you've picked up on some really important themes there. Thank you both so much for being so candid and wise. There was so much that you said there that was, I think people watching will take away and apply to their lives. I think it would be ironic if people went away from this webinar feeling depressed. So I do want to give you the opportunity, just to wrap up, to say a couple of sentences each, just something to give people hope, if you wouldn't mind.
I'd like to say that if you do have a depressive episode, it doesn't define your whole life. It doesn't mean you're going to feel that way forever. You might feel like that, and you know what, things can turn for you, and things usually do, and you won't always feel that way. You can lead a good, successful life with or without depression. So you will be okay.
Thank you.
It's very easy to feel the whole world is doom and gloom at the moment. You don't have to watch the news for too long till you find something horrific. But the truth is, depression doesn't affect everyone. It is common, but it's easy to think everyone is suffering, and it's not the case. It's common, but people do care about you, and in the same way you care about others. So do reach out, because things can usually do get better.
And I know that the reading agency are going to share on my website. I have a central hub with lots of sources of support, information and advice if anybody does want to do some more research. And now I'm going to hand back to Annie. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Natasha, and thanks to all three of you for a really honest and powerful discussion about just a really wonderful book that I think has the potential to really make a difference, as has been said, in so many people's lives. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. As Natasha said, if you or anyone that you know would like to access any further support, there's a roundup of all the places that you can seek that on Natasha's website, which is in the chat. You can also pick up a copy of this really, really wonderful book, The Boy Between, via the link in the chat. Recommend it to anyone that you know who might find it useful. I'd like to also thank our partners, Libraries Connected, in this event. And you can follow Amanda on Twitter at Mrs. Amanda Prowse. You can follow Natasha Devon at _Natasha Devon. And do join us for our next winter webinar, which will be next month, with author Millie Johnson talking about her new Christmas collection published by Simon & Schuster. So thank you once again to Amanda, to Josh and to Natasha for this really wonderful conversation and for making the time to really speak about such an important issue. And good night to everyone. Stay safe and thank you for joining us, and thanks for tonight. So, bye.